Well, we still have our team at Marrakesh for the IMF World Bank annual meeting. They've been giving us blow-by-blow reports of proceedings at Marrakesh, and our correspondent, John McCoy, had an exclusive interview with Patricia, Commonwealth Secretary General. Take a listen.
Thank you so much, Madam, for sharing this time with us at the meeting. Could you share with us, in preparation for this meeting, you've attended a couple of meetings so far here in Morocco. What are some of your expectations? What do you see at the end of all of this meeting?
Well, I think one of the huge issues we're all going to be exercised by is how do we respond effectively to the challenge of climate change and the exogenous shocks which we have all been subject to in the last couple of years. If you think about the impact of COVID and then the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and now we see there are more difficulties happening in the Middle East. But what's our response to that? Because we have the Bretton Woods structure, which may have been fit for the purpose in 1945, but needs radical reform if it's going to rise to the challenges that we now face in 2023 and going towards 2030. So we are going to be talking about the need for reform of the international financial institutions, the issues in relation to the vulnerability index. You know that the UN have the multi-dimensional vulnerability index, which came out of the Commonwealth's Universal Vulnerability Index, really created because the days when GDP could be the sole arbiter of whether you got concessional financing, it's really gone, because it doesn't bear the reality of the lived experience of many of our member states. You know that the Commonwealth has 56 member states, but 25 of them are small island developing states. We have 33 small states, 14 of the least developed states, and many of the developing states in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific are within our family. So their needs are complex, and they have been deleteriously affected by a number of these exogenous shocks. So these are the issues which are really at the forefront of our minds, and we've got to come up with a response to loss and damage. We made that commitment in Sharm el-Sheikh, but now what does it mean? What's the formula? What are we going to do with it? How are we going to make it work? And we're looking at new instruments. You know, if we're going to manage the debt, because many of our countries are either drowning because of sea level rise, or they're drowning in debt, and some of them are drowning in both at the same time. So I think there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of worry, but there's also a lot of hope, because I think we need dynamic, innovative, new ways of responding to these complex challenges.
You talked a lot about the smaller countries in the Commonwealth especially, and also the issue of climate funding. A lot of these countries have been expecting the promised funding for some years now. It seems not coming in as soon as they thought. And then on the other hand, you have bigger countries like the UK. So they seem to be slowing down on the implementation of promised climate change actions and, you know, reducing emissions.
Well, I think it's a really difficult time right now. And you're absolutely right. Way back in 2009, the world decided that they would commit $100 billion for climate adaptation mitigation for those developing countries who have been disadvantaged by the awful high increase in climatic disasters. And that just hasn't been honored yet. So there is a big drive to say that 100 billion has to be given annually, but also we know that if we are going to reach globally the targets we have set ourselves by 2030, we're going to need 4 trillion. So 100 million is a step in the right direction, but we know it's not enough. And it's not enough, and it cannot only be done by governments. So we know that there has to be a public-private partnership. We know that we've got to be more vigorous when we come to looking at debt, but we also know that the old approach, which says that the only arbiter for whether you should get funding or not is fiscal rectitude. There was this wonderful idea that if you just employed fiscal rectitude, you would be able to develop an economy which would feed your people, be able to educate them, be able to create the infrastructure. We know that's not true, because these exogenous shocks, so for example, if your country is hit by a Category 5 hurricane and you lose 226% of your GDP, go tell the hurricane that you were fiscally rectitude and that therefore it shouldn't have hit you. So these realities are really here now. The existential threat that the Commonwealth talked about in 1989 at the Langkawi Conference in Malaysia, where the Commonwealth family first identified this threat, is no longer a threat. It's here now, and we're feeling it. If we look at where we sit today, we're in Marrakesh. Thousands of people were affected by the disaster that was just a few weeks ago. And this is the new reality. And we think we have to come together and we have to find the financial instruments which will enable us to cope and cope better than we're coping right now. And those who have not been responsible for creating this climatic crisis, I think, have the least contribution to make, but they're actually making the greatest, because they're the ones who are suffering on the front line.
Well, sounds like you're describing Africa right there. So when we look at the situation of Africa, the funding hasn't come, and yet these countries are feeling the impacts of climate change. What should Africa be doing at this time?
Well, I think President William Ruto really had the clarion call when at the Africa Climate Summit, the first Africa Climate Summit, he said, this is not an either war. This should be a win-win. We're all in this together, the global north and the global south. But we have to innovate, we have to change, we have to jointly think about how we can change this. But, you know, he was talking about whether we should introduce a carbon tax, talking about the fact that Africa is the cradle of humanity, and that Africa could very likely be the element which could create the innovation, the creativity to solve some of these problems. And we know that innovation is going to be fundamentally important. So Africa has to deal with the problem that she has found herself in, but which she has not created. And that response means that she has to use all her ingenuity. And the ingenuity that has been shown in Africa is absolutely phenomenal. Look at what people are doing in terms of taking advantage of green and blue economy, green and blue energy. And these new opportunities are real. I think Kenya has about, 97% of her energy is green. I mean, she's leading the way, and others are wanting to follow her. But there's a whole way that we can restructure. We're looking at debt swaps for nature, nature-based solutions, creating a regenerative model of development, which will take into account the changes that we need. You know what the Commonwealth has been doing in terms of creating a blue charter, a living lands charter, using common sensing, which is the program we called. But what that uses geospatial data in order to enable us to better understand and better deliver the the sort of innovative changes we need. We've got the connectivity agenda, which is trying to bring us to the point where we will be able to do more. So all of these things are important. We've created a climate finance access hub to help our countries to get the money that they need by putting a climate finance advisor in countries. We've now got 19 of them. And we've trained more than 2,500 climate advisors across the Commonwealth to try and get the finance. I think it was the minister from South Africa who said, when we're talking about climate, we have not to be ashamed or run away from the F word. The F word was finance. Because that's what we need. We need the money. And that's what Africa needs to do. That's what we all need to do. We need to work in partnership, come together, and we need to be the change we want to see. And it's not going to happen unless we make it.
And earlier in this conversation, you describe, the flood, both that of natural flood and that of debt. And it's not for just a few countries in Africa. What do you see as a way out of this huge debt and the request for debt restructuring?
I do. We've created in the Commonwealth Secretariat a new debt management system called Meridian, which not only seeks to manage the public debt, but also seeks to manage private debt as well. About 40 countries are using that, and 36 of those countries are our Commonwealth countries. So we've got to improve debt transparency. We also have to look at the level of interest that our member states are paying on that debt. The least developed countries are paying 3 times as much in debt interest rates than others, although they borrow half as much. The fact that many of our countries are spending more on debt interest than we are receiving on overseas development aid. So there has to be a recalibration of how that is done. There has to be fairness. We've been talking about climate justice, but we also need to look at debt justice, because you know that there's a direct correlation between the level of debt and indebtedness many of our countries have and the level of disasters to which they have been subject. And those disasters were not of their making. So this idea that we have to recalibrate, we've got to look at the Universal Vulnerability Index, we've got to understand vulnerability, we've got to understand what we need to do in order to enhance this opportunity for concessional funding. But this is not because people are looking for favours or handouts. All of the countries I have spoken to are determined to help themselves, but they do need a little headspace to enable them to do that. And whilst they are having to pay disproportionately more in interest rates than their brothers and sisters from the global north, they're never going to be able to catch up. So we have to look at what fairness means and to calibrate more accurately if we're talking about responsibility and culpability for indebtedness. Where did that debt come from? And that's why we were talking earlier about this whole idea of fiscal rectitude. Most of our countries were incredibly prudent and very careful and paid back their debt. That didn't mean they got cheap loans, concessional funding. It didn't mean that they got debt forgiveness. So I think we do have to look again. A number of our countries have been using, as I mentioned earlier, debt for nature swaps. It's not saying I won't pay, but let me pay for the things that's going to save my country from drowning. Let me pay for the things that are going to educate my children, enable my families to be healthy by getting the right medical care, helping me to build a better infrastructure for my country so I can grow my own wealth. So these issues are at the forefront of our discussions now. And we need solutions, and we need solutions which have a human face and bear some reality to the lived experience of the people of the world. And I think what COVID taught us, I hope, was that we will never be safe until others are safe, and we will never be rich whilst others remain desperately poor.
Well, there's this notion that most African countries are in debt today, in spite of the resources, natural resources, which have remained untapped. And it's all because of corruption and mismanagement of resources. What are your thoughts on this?
I think what you have to do is to be brutally honest about the nature of corruption and the nature of the anti-corruption measures that we've made. If you look at corruption, you look at the money the world has and the money the world needs to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals. The difference between those figures is the sum equivalent to that which has been siphoned off. And then you have to ask another question. If, which is not admitted, there is corruption in certain regions, where does the money flow to, and where does the money flow from? So I think if we are being honest and fair, we have to accept it's a global problem which needs a global solution. And fiscal management does not protect you from crises which are exogenous shocks out with your control. So none of our countries could have predicted, nor were they responsible for COVID. Yet COVID has had a deleterious impact on all of our economies. None of us could control, certainly those in the global south, climate change, because climate change in the main is man-made and made out with the countries who are most disadvantaged by it. So I think it's complex, but it would be far too simplistic to say this is down to one aberrant consequence. It isn't. But I think everybody has to step up and accept that there's a multiplicity of causes to this, and we need a multifaceted response.
And that was an exclusive interview with Patricia Scotland, Commonwealth Secretary General, and that was our correspondent, Ini John Mekwa, right there in Marrakesh, handling that interview. So we'll take a break now. When we come back, commodities market update is next. Stay with us.